Hello Internet, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the challenges and advantages the Continental Army had during the American Revolution. So first is first, what is the Continental Army? Well, it was the United States of America's first army. The one that they formed to honestly fight the British. So there are dozens upon dozens and dozens of challenges that they faced. This is tended to just kind of be like the major ones, essentially. So probably the largest challenge that they faced was just supplies. They weren't able to get food, boots, blankets, guns, gunpowder, anywhere near reliable. The continental United States really struggled with their supply lines. They just didn't have any. They just started. So, how did they solve their supply issues? Is the question. Well, fun fact, if you weren't aware, dead soldiers don't need boots. They don't need guns, and they don't need powder. So, whenever they would win a battle, they would take the equipment from the British. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than walking around barefoot with no guns, no bullets. They also went around to the various states or colonies that they were in and around to ask for assistance. So the reason they did that is because in the original formation of the United States of America, the states actually had significantly more power than the federal government. Now, of course, that's different than today, but when it first was around, that's what it was. So the army had to actually ask the states individually, can we get some supplies to fight the British? Some helped, some didn't. You know, some gave more support, some gave less support. It honestly just depended. The other thing, the thing that like actually ended up probably not completely solving it, but making it much less of an issue is when the French actually entered the war as a major supporter of the United States. They didn't do it from the very beginning, but they did invite themselves into the war and assist the Americans. I say invited themselves, like the Americans asked them to assist the American Revolution. They mostly did this because they were large rivals of Britain, and Britain losing the 13 colonies was a significant blow to British power. Another issue that they heavily struggled with, and honestly never really solved, was the disease. Now, keep in mind this was 1776, so a number of years ago. So the standards of sanitization were not what they are today. Like they didn't know about germs and all that fun stuff. But beyond that, the camps that the Continental Army had were significantly overcrowded. They had really poor sanitation even for the time. You know, they had the toiletries were mixed in with everything else. Like it was just a big mess. Now, they never really, like I said, they never really solved this problem. They more or less just limited it. So they were able to quarantine the sick, did better sanitation methods that were better at the time. It definitely lowered the casualty rate and softened the number of individuals that were sick, but ultimately fixed the problem. Another heavy issue that they struggled with was a number of desertions at the time. Initially, the United States was really struggling in the war. They were losing battle after battle. They weren't making any success. And because of that, the army had really low morale. But another thing that didn't help, the government was broke. The federal government, when the United States of America was initially formed, did not have the power to tax. You know, because obviously that was a big point of the revolution. So, because of that, they weren't able to use said taxes to pay the army. Because of this, one of the ways that they attempted to solve the no taxation issue is they just overprinted money, but the thing is, when you overprint money, it heavily devalues it, making it basically worthless. Another issue with the desertions is honestly soldiers would do really short enlistments, a few months to maybe a year. That was a problem when the war took multiple years to actually end. So how did they solve these issues? Well, they honestly they won more engagements. That really helped morale. Like actually winning fights and proving that you can compete with the British militarily really helped with morale. They also got loans from British rivals. They got like loans from the French. I want to say the Spanish helped here and there. It's mostly the French. Like almost wholeheartedly, the French funded the American Revolution. Another issue that they struggle with is that they are not a professional army by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, these were like farmers and blacksmiths and things like that. They had no formal training versus the British, like dedicated military men and mercenaries. But beyond that, there was also not a standardized training regime in the colonial army. The officers just kind of trained their troops to the best of their ability. And because of that, the training and resilience of the troops varied from unit to unit quite heavily. They also had really light naval capacities. Now, the colonial army did have a very small navy. I want to say maybe a handful of ships, but it wasn't they didn't have a navy, it just was fairly unconsequential. They were mostly pirates that were turned into privateers. Now, this wasn't their army, this was separate, but essentially the United States government was like, hey, here's a paper, go rob the British and you can keep whatever you get. And the pirates were like, yeah, we'll be privateers for you. They were immensely helpful because the British had to send resources to deal with the privateers, and it basically limited their naval capabilities against the actual colonies. But the main way that they fixed this was honestly, once again, the French. The French actually had a navy and were very capable of competing with the British, and they did. There were a number of naval battles fought between the French and the British during this time, as well as a number of privateers and colonial ships engaging with the British. What helped them solve their standardized training was the French also sent Navy and officers to train American troops. That helped immensely. The final main challenge for them to overcome was the fact that they were just immensely outnumbered almost the entire time. The British had around 50,000 enlisted, dedicated soldiers. They also hired 30,000-ish, give or take, mercenaries to assist in the engagement. The Continental Army itself was constantly changing. There were a few times where it got as low as a couple thousand. It ballooned up to as much as 30 or 40,000. These were constantly changing to desertion, enlistments, death, injury, all of the things that affected war. The Continental Army used snipers to help significantly with this. I don't know if it was the first recorded use of snipers, but I know it's definitely up there. They would essentially equip their crack shots, or their best shots, with rifles. Now, rifles did exist at the time, and they were significantly more accurate, but they took significantly longer to go. A musket could get 4-ish shots in a minute. A rifle might be able to get 1, because in order to make it accurate, you have to put a lot more extra time into your shots. So, essentially, the American snipers would hide in a nearby forest or whatever, and they would take shots at the British officers. Now, at this time, warfare was, I'm going to shoot at you, then while I'm reloading, you're going to shoot at me, and we're going to do this until one side surrenders or dies. Numbers played a significant role in this. Now, snipers changed that, because if you kill the officer, the troops don't know what to do. So that allowed the Americans to get a heavy advantage in a number of engagements. French reinforcements also significantly helped the colonial army. I don't believe the French committed significantly to the American Revolution, but they did commit troops to the engagement. Because, I mean, they didn't want an all-out war with Britain, but they definitely didn't want the America to lose either, if that makes sense. They did have a number of very, very strong advantages that are very important. One of the strong advantages they had was just they had better leadership. I mean, they had George Washington, who, despite all of the challenges that I've listed and more that they ran into, he was able to keep the army together and functioning with minimal supplies and support. Beyond that, the troops were also fighting for their homes, and that is a very, very strong motivator. I mean, if you're fighting for your own home, you're going to be a lot more motivated to keep people out of your home than if you're going overseas to fight somebody else. Which is a benefit that they had, was that the British troops and the mercenaries, they didn't have a personal stake in the engagement. They were just there because the crown was paying them to be there. They didn't care about the American colonies. It didn't mean anything to them. Their life, after the war was over, their life didn't change much, whether the Americans won or the Americans lost. So they didn't really care either way. The other thing that the Americans had was the fact that they knew the area and were able to engage in guerrilla warfare, which I still think was a fairly early tactic in that days. I don't think it was the first recorded case, because I want to say guerrilla warfare was used in the medieval times as well. But essentially, they'd make quick strikes against supply lines and key targets, and then you'd basically disappear. You wouldn't do these all-out engagements. You'd come in, you hit your target, you leave. That was very common, especially in the southern colonies during the American Revolution. So there are a lot of the things to talk about beyond that as far as the American Revolution. Like, one of the things that the French downside that they had for helping in the American Revolution was that they basically caused like a revolution in France shortly after this, because they essentially I don't think it by itself bankrupted France. I'm struggling with that. It didn't directly bankrupt France to assist the American Revolution, but it certainly didn't help, because they were struggling financially at the time. They were awaiting power. But that's a video for a whole nother day, and if there's anything else you want me to talk about or explain, let me know in the comments. Bye.
Ammo going out! Throwing shotgun!